The whole reason why Fort William Henry was built here was for the British to claim this lake. The British called it Lake George. The French called it Lake du Saint-Sacrement. So right here, a titanic battle was fought between two empires, the British and the French. And that's why that fort was built in 1755. I'm standing in the courtyard of Fort William Henry, or at least the reconstructed version of it. The original fort was built in 1755, and it was built to keep a hold of British territory here on Lake George. Now, the reconstructed fort is built almost exactly like it was in 1755. And if you look around the courtyard, you have a garden, you have barracks, you have today a museum, and we're going to take you through all that today so you get a good idea what this fort looks like today. We're standing in the main museum of Fort William Henry, and on display are actual artifacts that were found on the site. It starts with the beginning of Native American occupation of this area, the French claiming the lake itself, and then it goes on to the British occupation of this area. You can see here Sir William Johnson. He's the one that won the Battle of Lake George in 1755, beginning the British occupation of this area. The dioramas and the exhibits go on, and like I said before, they have actual artifacts that were found on site. You can see muskets, you can see musket balls, and any kind of military equipment that would have gone along with an 18th century army in this area. We're under one of the casemates of Fort William Henry, and what you just saw was a oven used to heat the fort and also to cook. So that's actually original to 1755. And if you follow me this way, we're going to look at one of the storage areas that were used, that was used during the occupation of the fort. This storage area would have been used to store military weapons and supplies, but also was used as a hospital during the siege itself in 1757. You can see dioramas showing this. In this case, this is a surgery happening. So this casemate would have been a den of activity during the siege itself in 1757. Behind me, what looks like a prison was actually not a prison. That's where the supplies would have been stored and locked away so that nobody could get at them during the occupation of the fort itself. Out there is Lake George, and that's what the British were claiming when they built this fort here in 1755. Now, during the siege in 1757, when the French came from the north, they surrounded the fort and they bombarded this bastion, the northwest bastion. So the French cannons would have been firing into this. This nearly collapsed, and basically the fort was in a really bad spot. It could not get supplies, it was cut off, and the French bombarded it really into submission. The British held on as long as they could. Cut off from supplies, cut off from reinforcements. General Webb did not send reinforcements from Fort Edward. The British were forced to surrender. When the British surrendered and left the fort, they were immediately attacked by Native American allies, by the Marquis de Montcalm, the French commander, who in many ways didn't want to see that happen, but the Native Americans attacked anyway. The result was the Fort William Henry massacre of 1757. Which is one of the worst massacres that were recorded at the time. We don't know if it was exaggerated or not. However, it does cause the British to fight even harder. Through that gun port, which is today it looks like a parking lot, beyond that parking lot is where the entrenched camp was, that really a lot of the colonial British troops were, and a lot of savage fighting happened there as well. This fort couldn't hold that many troops, only about 400, so a lot of the fighting took place in that entrenched camp up on the hill in those trees. So what is represented by the reconstructed fort is what life would have been like in everyday Fort William Henry at the time of the British occupation. You saw a little garden. Obviously they would need fresh greens and vegetables. You also see here a well. This well was dug by Rogers Rangers in 1756, and this was the drinking water that would have been used in the fort itself. Behind me, in a very secure location of the fort itself, would have been the powder magazine. That's where all the ammunition and the gunpowder would have been stored. Now, the reason why it's so secure is because if that blows up, the entire fort is in jeopardy. So it is closed right now because of COVID, but if you went down there, you would see a very secure area with ammunition and gunpowder. Below me is the crypt, and in it would have been the remains of British soldiers that were killed after the surrender of the fort. The wounded were kept here. Native Americans came in and the French, and many of the British were slaughtered. Now, one Jesuit priest remembers a Native American emerging from this area with a trophy of a human head. So the fighting was brutal, and the after effects were even worse. I'm here with Kyle Durkee. He's an administrative assistant here. He's been kind enough to give us a little tour of the fort. And Kyle, just tell us a little bit about the fort itself and what you guys do here.
Right, so Fort William Henry was a French and Indian war fort that was burned down in August 1757. It was rebuilt in the 1950s, and it stood here ever since. Now, we give tours throughout our main museum. We have soldiers here on our parade ground that offer live musket and cannon firing demonstrations. People come through from all over the place to visit our fort and learn some of our best artifacts here. Like this French 18-pound cannon that was found in Lake George in the 1950s. We believe that it was actually intended to be used on Fort William Henry, or it was actually used on Fort William Henry when it rolled off one of the French boats and sank to the bottom of Lake George.
I'm here with George Painter. He's one of the tour guides here at Fort William Henry. And can you please tell me a little bit about the garden behind you?
Sure, I'm a farmer by trade from outside the Albany area, and I was hired here by Colonel Monroe to help set up some gardens around the fort that will help feed all of the folks that are here. This is a demonstration garden for the Colonel only, but there's major gardens outside the fort over here and in the back, and we grow enough food for the summer and fall to feed about 2,000 people that live here at the fort.
Now, why do you think fresh vegetables are so important for a soldier?
Well, you know, the supply chain is critical to any army, and you cut it off and you're in deep trouble, and to be able to grow our own food gives us more control, and it's delicious, nutritious stuff, and it makes everyone happier. We make great stews and soups, and the vegetables that we grow, from squash to corn to beans, we have everything you can imagine, cabbage, and it makes great food.
Now, was this considered a far outpost in the British Empire? In other words, so there weren't many large cities around here at all, yeah?
No large cities. We're at the end of the supply chain. We get our supplies from New York that ships to Albany, that ships up to Fort Edward, that ships up to here by wagon. And we get a couple wagons a day, horse-drawn, bringing us supplies. But anything that we can do, hunting and fishing and gardening, that will supplement our work here. This is the northernmost outpost for the British Army at the time in 1755.
And vulnerable to a French attack.
Oh, the French are not far away. They're right up the lake at the other end of the lake, and they thought they claimed this until we built the fort here, and we're ready to engage with them at any time.
Well, I will tell you this, it's people like him that do tour guiding and love history that keep history alive, and I thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, my pleasure.
Excellent, excellent. I'm here with Rob Frazier. He is the head guide here at Fort William Henry, and I wanted to ask him about the everyday life of a soldier here at the fort.
All right, so the everyday soldier that would be here at Fort William Henry would have come from multiple backgrounds. Traditionally, they were skilled craftsmen, many coming from the New England colonies, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and the Hampshire grants. These men coming here would have been very skilled laborers, carpenters, shipbuilders, things of that nature, but they were also tailors and coopers and shoemakers. These men would have come here to be the labor force, the backbone, I guess you could say, of the British Army. As these men would come here, it's them that would build this fort. You know, the British Redcoat or regular, of course, they're working as well, but they are professional soldiers. That's their job.
Okay.
Lots of the colonial troops, the everyday soldier that was here, spent a great deal of time here at this fort.
Now, how many soldiers would have been in this fort itself?
At any given time, there could be between 450 and 500 soldiers in here, as that's what the fort was equipped to house. But unfortunately, we don't really see those numbers. Most of the soldiers actually choose to stay in the entrenched encampment because of the sickness and disease that's taking place within the walls here.
Wow. What kind of disease? Smallpox, was that a problem?
Smallpox was rampant here, especially in 1756. Smallpox, dysentery, and even malaria. And they had a hunch that came from the water out of the well.
Wow.
They don't know whether they dug too deep or too shallow, but they weren't getting the lake water like they had hoped for.
Really? Wow. Yeah. Now, was this considered a desirable post to be posted to?
If you were a ranger, maybe like yourself, being here a little bit closer to home and reinforcement, it probably wouldn't be so bad. More ideal for raiding parties and such.
Right.
But being on the edge of no man's land is probably not the place that you really want to be. You know,
Not much nightlife, I would imagine.
I couldn't imagine. No.
So the average soldier that was posted here really just wanted to be rotated probably home at some point.
And you know, even Fort Edward, 16 miles south, was much more of a sought after place.
Really?
Because of the locale being on the Hudson River, people coming in and out. You have the ability to go to Albany and the settlements in Saratoga, which isn't very far,
Right.
you know, in 18th century terms, I guess, where being out here, you're literally in the middle of nowhere.
Right.
Supplies actually being brought up the military road from Fort Edward to here are being dumped off by wagoners because the wagoners are afraid to come all the way up here. So.
Well, maybe can you tell me a little bit about the battle in 1757?
Sure. In 1757, as the French approached, General Montcalm had a goal in mind. He wanted to take this fort in a couple of days, eventually move on to Fort Edward and take that fort, which would leave the road to Albany wide open, and that was the British military capital at this point in time. So that would have been ideal for the French. However, little old Fort William Henry here stood for 6 days. The men fighting valiantly, although their 17 old iron guns were bursting daily from overuse and what have you. And on day 6, they had to unfortunately surrender the fort. This surrender, though, was in a European style. Honorable terms were given, which allowed the garrison to pack up all of their personal belongings, including their guns. No ammunition, however, that all had to stay. They could take the colors of their king and even one cannon, a field cannon, of course, and take it with them off to Fort Edward, being paroled for 18 months. But of course, for the European armies, this was fantastic, right? It is said that both armies actually got together and feasted in the evening. But the Native Americans that were allied with the French were kind of left out of these terms. So as they entered the fort here, not finding what they were looking for, a massacre of sorts ensues.
And it becomes a very famous massacre, and I know it ignites the British public really against the French even more.
Absolutely. You know, in many ways, you can kind of look at Fort William Henry as almost a turning point. After what happens here, and the British using this as propaganda, of course, you see enlistments double.
Wow.
In many cases throughout New England, and these men coming to the southern shores of Lake George again in 1758 will be part of a much larger army under General Abercrombie, nearly 16,000 men.
And they'll go up and attack Fort Carillon in 1758. Yeah.
And that's really the last major British defeat
Yeah.
of the war, if you think about it. They will lose big time.
Yeah.
Nearly 2,000 men
Yeah.
being lost. And then they'll come back down here, and of course General Amherst will take over in 59, and that's when the ball starts moving in the other direction.
And one last question for
Sure.
you. The movie Last of the Mohicans. Can you tell me how accurate parts of it are?
Well, you know, oddly enough, as far as material culture, it is a little bit better than, say, The Patriot,
Yes.
that comes out 10 years later.
Yeah.
But the story is a love story. It's not it's totally historical fiction.
Right.
There was a Colonel Monroe. He did not, however, get his heart ripped out by Magua.
Right.
And I haven't really researched him as a person too much, but I believe he had a couple sons, not a couple daughters.
Right.
So, you know, there's that element. But of course, the 60th Royal Americans, they were in and out of here.
Right.
So that part's true. People being adopted, like Hawkeye,
Right.
being
right.
adopted into the native tribes. That happened.
And how
throughout
about the
18th
massacre scene?
That is probably one of the best scenes to give somebody an idea of what would have happened.
Yeah.
Although they do leave out really them coming into the fort and,
Right.
and what happened here, it gives a good idea of what would have happened at the end of that column as it was marching away. Unfortunately, a lot of those soldiers did die. The numbers are all over the place,
Right.
depending on the historian you talk to. But unfortunately, the native people being upset, that's what happens, and the French are going to learn a lesson. They're going to lose a lot of their Native American allies after this.
Yeah, it's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate you spending time with us.
Absolutely.
Again, I want to thank him. Rob, it's people like this that keep history alive, and we want to see this place going and getting more people coming and visiting. Thank you again, Rob.
Yo, you're very welcome. Thank you so much for having me.
I think during the siege of Fort William Henry in 1757, this was the scene of an armed camp. The fort, which you can't see, it's through those trees over there, the fort can only hold about 400 men. The British had a couple of thousand. So this spot was a fortified camp. And as a matter of fact, this is where most of the fighting took place at the siege of Fort William Henry. The British had fortified this area. This is where a lot of the provincial troops were. And when the French put the fort under siege, they also attacked this area as well. Good. This is the ruins of Fort George. This was built after the Battle of Fort William Henry. When Fort William Henry was destroyed by the French moved back up to Fort Carillon. They didn't have enough men to keep this area, and the British did return. Now the French are eventually forced out of the Lake George region, and this became the largest fort in this area.